Well, welcome once again to the class this evening. This is the Old Testament class. So we're still busy with the David stories. And we come here we're going to look at 1 Kings chapter 1 and about the death of King David. So this is the story when King David dies and King Solomon takes his place. So 1 Kings chapter 1 begins by saying that King David is very, very old and weak. He's probably about 70 years old, but he's an old 70. We know from the stories of King David that, he served about 30 years and he was very strong and very vigorous. He fought off his enemies and he was chased through the wilderness and he was often in hiding. King Saul was often chasing him through the wilderness. Finally, King Saul died in battle with the Philistines. And then David took the kingship. So David was king for probably about 30 years. And now he's old and tired. And he can't stay warm. So his men looked throughout the whole land of Israel to find a beautiful virgin. And they found a young woman called Abishag. And Abishag was brought to take care of King David. She tended King David and fed him and took care of him. She also lay beside him to keep him warm. But they did not have sexual relations. David had several sons, and one of them was called Adonijah. Adonijah was a brother to Absalom. Remember the story when their other brother, a man called Amnon, molested Tamar. Absalom was very angry with Amnon and he killed him. And then Absalom dies. Remember, he's fleeing and he gets his hair caught in an oak tree and he's left hanging there in the oak tree.
Nothing not aware that le aware Palua Kane now where that he where that bonnet legacy your poco, no la poco, bonnet Kothuche buwe that le aware the oak tree pado allo, bonnet Kothuche buedamo.
And then Joab, the commander of David's army, goes and kills Absalom.
Lawine na aware so you are la me where that sopa da we athiko padone no lebane Matthew where that so abshalonilo.
Okay, so 3 brothers, Amnon, Absalom, and Adonijah.
Tiweda padop with ano, padop with Quathaga la miweda, sabano, no sabshalo, no ne so adoniape.
Amnon is dead and Absalom is dead.
Keda sabano nethiweda, no sabshalo nethiweda.
And that leaves Adonijah.
Mokene otiweda lusa adoniamo.
So Adonijah hears about King David being very weak, so weak that he can hardly get out of bed.
Pe ine so adonia na weda lusa pada wine na gisabasa weda do mana, aweda gotola lo markelebamo.
And Adonijah thinks, here's my chance to get the throne.
Pene so adonia si weda le kene me da itakweta ya le ke doni bage weda awe lobsumo.
Here's my chance to get the kingship.
Kene me weda itakweta ya le ke doni ba weda tamisopalo.
Adonijah calls all his friends together and he has his friends declare him to be king.
Pene no so adonia ko weda ati tuko tir pakele kesi bane no ama weda ati tuko pala poki tir pane no le ko boba tinya weda le aweda me da sopani no.
So they're having a great festival and a great party, and there's lots of dancing and drinking, and Adonijah is declared king.
Pena wetir pa ueda do mu pue pa do no. Panenia wetir pa ota rekeli mu pue pa do pania wetir pa no no. Bubatinya weda lu sardunia ni mi weda sopani lo.
Now Nathan, the prophet, hears about this.
Penny no wina thala mi weda wini no weda na weda tagiweni lo.
And he goes to Bathsheba, Solomon's mother.
Penny ni weda le weda suno Bathsheba la mi weda so Shlomo amua oni lo.
And Nathan the prophet tells Bathsheba, you go to King David's bedchamber and tell him what's going on.
Penny no wina thasiba weda no Bathsheba la weda kabale weda lu sopa da wea o bane kabatsiba te ba le tamata tirpani lo.
Tell him about what Adonijah is doing.
Te ba le tale so adonia mawenirki.
And then Nathan said, when you're halfway through the story, I will rush in and tell the same story.
Awe siwe da no lete o bane ne numu lun lucky ne je le khiwe da klikle lun lucky bane ge si ba le talen tet mi khoni lo.
So that's what they did. Bathsheba goes to the king. She begins telling the king about what Adonijah is doing.
Penene no Bathsheba we da le so pa o blasiba te ba we da tale so adonia ma we da.
She says, I thought you said that Solomon was going to be king.
Aweda si weda is so como weda le no ni solo na ta do ya le so Solomon ya weda ke mi weda so pa ya.
And then Nathan rushed in and told the same story.
Penene no wina ta le wani weda bla weda te weda ta mi kho.
King David said, yes, I did say Solomon would be king after me.
Me so da we si weda me ye te weda le so Solomon na ke mi weda so pa le to weda le yiloni lo.
King David gives the command for Solomon to be anointed king.
Penene so pa da we weda hilo weda ta le so Solomon ko bata do pu la ke mi weda so pa ni lo.
There's a lesson to be learned if you look at Proverbs 16, verse 9.
Pene tamalo le na poko ba malo ni weda le mi weda le todo so do te si khu sabo kwi ke le todo so do te si khu sabo kwi ne si wede pa cái nhỏ ta cụ we akle lo me yua skhe atwe da lo
A man can make plans as to how things should go, but the Lord directs things.
phe ne siwe da no pa ga ne no awe da do ata re ta kle da we na ta ku tho pha lo da we ti we da pa satana ki ne no ka sa yua ne awe da mi we da pa ga le askhe we da kle mo
Adonijah had all sorts of plans about how things were going to be, but the Lord directs the course of history.
so adonia na we da re kle we da ta kele ke se le ka ba le ta ba ge ba wo ke te to we da ba satana ki ne no ka sa yua da we mi we da pa ga la skhe we da ta si so te so ni lo
And the Lord had determined already that Solomon would be king after David.
ka sa yua we da awe so te we da li le so pa sholomo ke we da so pa ne so da we lo ki no
Maybe while we're at it, we could also look at Proverbs 19, verse 21.
pa we da no li ko to do so do si kwi so po kisit si we di ta ku tho pha lo a mi o lo pa ka nya ta ki pu lo me yua ku tho ta ne ko o so kle lo
So, a similar message. Man makes all sorts of plans. I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that. Adonijah, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that. But the Lord directs the course of history.
ni we da ta ka so mi kho lo pa ko po ne ku tho da le ka ma di e ka ma di ne so adonia we da re kle we da le ka ma di e ka ma di ne ke re kle da di ne ba satana ki na ka sa yua na we da mi da pa ga le askho da ta su su te so a to ko ne lo
Now, there was another very strange thing going on in Israel in that there were two high priests.
ta la ma tha no le a lo so lo la we da ki mi no pe pe ini no le ke we da wa lu ta ni we da ki ga pe mo
There was supposed to be only one high priest, but for some reason, there were two.
le pa lu ta do ne ka ba we da lo to ga lo mo ba sa na ke pe pe ne no ta la lo so de mi a ne ne mi we da le pa lu ta do we da ki ga pe ni
They were both descended from Aaron. There was Abiathar and there was Zadok, two high priests, both descended from Aaron, the original high priest.
a we ti pa ki ga le ne no he lo se we da le so a ha ro no la mi we da le a we so pa lu ta do a ko ti le nya ke ni ne to ga no no ke we da le a mi we da no pa ki ga I ni me da so I ba ya tha da we ga ni no mi we da so sa do mo
So the one high priest, Abiathar, supported Adonijah.
le pa lu ta do a we ga ni no la mi we da so I ba ya tha a we da so thwe we da so do ni ya ki
Zadok supported Solomon.
me me le no so sa do ni na we da so thwe da so Solomon ni lo
Also, Joab, the commander of David's army, supported Abiathar.
Pone le mi we da so yo a le so pa da we a ti ko pa do ni na we da so thwe we da so abaya tha ni lo
Okay, so you had Adonijah, supported by high priest Abiathar and by Joab, commander of David's army.
pe I ni no we da le we so adonia no bata so thwe le paluta ado la me da so abaya tha no ni bata so thwe le so yo a la me da so da we a ti ko pa do ni no
And you had Nathan the prophet and Zadok, the other high priest. They supported King Solomon.
no pepe ini no awe so winatha do so sado na me da paluta do awe da so thwe da so Solomon lo
So this is a terrible time in Israel, as there were many terrible times.
da we de na me we da ta so to le a we da do ma le Israela a so to no ke da ta se to le ko ke we da le Israel su ka ne we da ama
Adonijah and Solomon were struggling for the throne.
ke we da le so Adonia do so Solomon na we da ge plu ge sa lu gu ni we da we lo so
Some of the powerful people supported Adonijah, and others, powerful people, supported King Solomon.
wala pwe da ta so ta ko mo to no no ne ne so thwe we da so Adonia do la ga to no no la o da ta so ta ko mo ne no so thwe we da so Solomon ni lo
So things were pulling apart. It was great tension within Israel because of this.
me we da ta le Israel pu ne no ba ta thu pha kwi o no we da do ta phi se no le ta we ye ho
But the Lord directs his path.
ba sa ta na ke ne no ka sa ywa ne no we da so we da kle ni lo
When Adonijah heard that David had given the command for Solomon to be crowned, he became very scared.
lo phe ne ne so Adonia we da na we da le so pa da we he lo we da ta kle le so pa Solomon no ka ba ta du ku to so pa ko tu lu ne no a we da pli da phu da ni lo
And as I said, Adonijah and his friends were having a great big party. They felt that they had power, that they had established Adonijah as king.
da si si mi ka tho no sa do ni ya da ti to ko ti pa do pa le a so thwe o ti pa no ma we da mu pwe pha do ba ne na we ti pa ti to le su lo pa tho we da so Adonia le a ka mi we da so pa ne
But then, as soon as they heard that King David had given the throne to Solomon, all of Adonijah's friends fled.
Penny na we ti pa na tu la na hu we da le so pa da we hi lo ta kle le du plot we da so pa ko tu le so Solomon bla ne ke we da so Adonia da ti to ko ti pa ke le ke si khi we da ni lo
It's almost comical. There's Adonijah having a great big party, and suddenly all of his friends flee and leaving him all alone, all by himself.
Now, log away da le away ka ne ta lo ni we da le ha sa mo. Away ti pa ma we da mu pwe pa do no o we be we da pa sa tna kin no. Ti la we ti pa na we da ta ka so le so pa shelo mo ba da. De ke le so pa bla ne na we ti pa. Khi kwe da ba ne pa lo we da pa ti we da the so Adonia the ga ne lo.
Adonijah became, as you could well understand, very scared, and he fled to the tabernacle.
Pene ne no so Adonia ne na we ti pa. Away pli we da ta do ma ba ne away da khi we da le away ta le hi ne lo.
And at the tabernacle, there was the great bronze altar with horns coming off the four corners. And he went and he seized the horns of the altar.
Awe da khi we da le de so ski no le so ski ne we da we da kaneta le lo la mama da le to bo mo ba da we da awe po ka we da le lo la me we da to bo ni mo.
So Adonijah was seeking sanctuary at the tabernacle.
Penny so Adonia ne khu ti ne we da o ku du ya lo le awe de so ski ni lo.
No one was going to kill him when he had his hands on the altar.
Puat Matthew nor ga ba na pele patio la we da achu no po ka we da le we da lu lo po ko mo.
So word came to Solomon that Adonijah had laid hold of the altar.
Dagutu hewe da su so Solomon ole na we da le so Adonia ni awe da hika we da no da lu lo mo.
Solomon had mercy and he said, I won't kill you. Go to your house and behave yourself.
Penny awe so Solomon no takinyo ba na te le yedo matina ba no keke ni no awe kili ni riki.
So that's the situation. King Solomon is now king.
Penny mi we da tauta so pa Solomon ni ke na we da mi da so pa.
And David's getting older and weaker.
So pa da we da ta pa tawe da gi sa lot do tawe da.
So he's nearing death, and then he calls Solomon. He gives his final instructions to Solomon.
Pene na we da bugthi we da li ba ne ne ko da so pa shlomo la we hi la we da ta thu su ne kle ne lo.
He tells Solomon, "You are king now. The Lord give you wisdom to do what you have to do to make your throne secure."
Pe ne no awe so pa da we da si we da ke ne me we da so pa li no ako ne ne ko ba ma we da ta le ne ko ba ma ne no ako ne ta le ne bon mu no ko bi be wa ne no ne ko ba ma we da ta le ne ko ba ma ne lo.
So it's a violent time yet as Solomon makes his throne secure.
Na me we da no ta se ko to no le so pa shlomo we da ta ko se ma ko ne apate le ne ko ba ma ta le ne ma ako ne me da ta chok to la ri do la awe da ko ba ma we da bo mu le we da ta bi ta be ne lo.
Remember Joab? Joab, who was the commander of David's army, he betrayed David and he betrayed Solomon by taking the side of Adonijah.
Ne te no ta dia no le awe so pa so yo a no la we da me we da so pa da we atuko pa do no le tu me kla no we da no awe the me kwi we da cha kwi we da awe so pa da we no mo da so pa shlomo mo.
Joab became very scared and he laid hold of the altar.
Pene ne no me le awe da ohu we da so adonia ko ne no awe da pli we da ta ko ne awe da he ba ne no awe da phoka we da awe da lu lo si ko.
He sought sanctuary in the tabernacle.
Di ta we da na ke da ku khu ni we da ta o gu du a lo le we de so ski ni lo.
But Joab had murdered 2 men in cold blood.
Ba sa ta na ki na so yo awe da ma ti we da pa ki ga no le we da kan ni ta de pa ke we da le da de plo ta pu mo.
He had murdered Abner, the commander of Saul's army.
Awe da ma ti we da no sa bne no la mi we da so pa so lu awe atikurga.
And he murdered another one of Saul's mighty men, a man called Amasa.
Ba we da ma ti we da si ko no awe da kan ni pwa la ga da no la mi we da so amisa no la mi da pwa le awe tu la gisurga mo.
Joab killed them not during a time of war, but he murdered them during a time of peace.
We so yo amathia we thiki ani no de me da ta so to le ta du ta ya so to ba mi me kan ni ma ti we da le ta khu ta po so to ni lo.
To take the life of a man in a time of war is one thing,
Le na ka ma ti we da pwa da ga no le nu me we da ta du ta ya ni mi we da ta mi.
but to sneak in a man's house and murder him during a time of peace is something completely different.
Ba sa ta na ke ne no awe na ka ma ti we da pwa da ga ni le la hi no le ta so to le ta mu ta khu so to ni no de mi we da ta la ba ba mo.
And that's what Joab had done.
Ta we ne mi we da le so yo ama we da ni lo.
So King Solomon said he has no right to think that he can find sanctuary at the tabernacle.
Penene no so pa shlomo no so mo da la we da so yo ani to da ta kweta ya la ka so mo da la a khu ni we da ta go du a lo le o we da kan le desas ni ba.
And Solomon sent a man called Benaiah, who was chief of David's bodyguard, to strike Joab dead at the altar.
Ma penene no so pa shlomo no so lo we da no pa la mi we da no so benaya no la mi we da so pa da we na thiko pa do kla de a kup na bodyguard da mo body ke da la ke le ma ti we da so yo ani lo.
Solomon made Benaiah the chief of his army.
Penny bani na sopa Solomon on duke tagoda so benaya la mi we da athiko pado la thi me glani lo.
Okay, so Joab, one of the men conspiring against Solomon, he's dead.
ဖဲနေနော်ဆောယိုအာနော်လာမီဝဲဒါပွားတကလာကူထော်ဒါဝဲဒါဆောရှလိုမွန်နေနော်ဝဲဒါစီဝဲဒါလီ
Now, you remember I said there were two high priests. There was Abiathar and there was Zadok.
နော်နေတင်တော့လေတဲ့နာနော်လေပလူတာအဒိုဝဲဒါခိကလာမီဒါဆောအဘယာသာဒေါ်ဆောဆာဒို
Abiathar had also conspired against Solomon.
ဆောအဘယာသာနော်ဝဲဒါနော်ကူထော်ဒါခုသူဝဲဒါဝဲတကနေဆောရှလိုမွန်စီကော
Solomon did not order Abiathar's death,
ဆောရှလိုမွန်နော်ဝဲဒါတီလတက်လူလဆောအဘယာသာနေကဘာစီဝဲပါ
but he told him to leave Jerusalem and return to his ancestral home.
အဝဲတဲဝဲဒါနော်ဆောအဘယာသာလာကဘာဟာတကွဲဒါလေယေရုရှလေပူဘနာဝဲဒါကဘာကေကေဝဲဒါလာမောပါဖိဖွေလောမ
To stay there and to never come back.
တဲဝဲဒါလာကဘာဝဲဒါဖဲနေမောသူတဲကေကေဒါကေကေနော်ဘလော်ဂီ
So then Zadok was the one and only high priest.
နော်ဝီဘနေနော်ဆောဆာဒိုနနာဝဲဒါမေဝဲဒါအဝဲပလူတာဒိုနော်တကားကီလောမ
Now that leaves Adonijah still as a danger to the throne.
နော်ဖဲဖဲယင်းနေနော်လေဆာဒိုနီယာနေနော်မေဒီတာတာပွားတကလာအလောပလီဝဲဒါတဘယိုအလောလေအဝဲလောပဆိုကောနေလော
Joab is gone, Abiathar is gone, Adonijah still there.
ဖဲနေနော်ဝဲတကနေဆောယိုအနေနော်အတူလဘာလောနေဆောအဘယာသနေတူလဘာပါစတနာကင်းနေနော်ဖဲဖဲအင်းနေနော်ဆောအဒိုနီယာနေဝဲဒါဒီ
Now, Adonijah did something very, very foolish.
နော်ဆောအဒိုနီယာနော်မတာတမီလဲကဲဝဲဒါလေအမေပွာလေအဟာဝဟာကောဒိုမာ
He goes to Bathsheba and he says, Bathsheba, grant me one request.
အဝဲလဲဝဲဒါဆူနော်နော်ဘာသရှိဘာအိုဘနေစီဝဲဒါနော်ဘာသရှိဘာနော်ဟီလာယာလေတခိကညာနာတမီမော
Bathsheba said, what would you like me to do for you?
ဖဲနေနော်နော်ဘာသရှိဘာစီဘာအလဲနော်နေအဒေါ်လေကမတမ်နူလဲနော်လေ
He said, go to King Solomon and ask that Abishag be given to me as my wife.
အဝဲဒါစီဝဲဒါနော်လေဆူဆောရှလမိုအိုဘနေတဲအလဲမဟီလောယာလေအဝဲနော်အဘိရှာနော်အဘိရှာလာကမီဝဲဒါယမနေတကေ
Remember Abishag, the young woman who came to keep King David warm?
နေတင်တော့နော်လေနာဘိရှာနေမီဝဲဒါပွားပေါ်မလို့ဘိုလအဟဲဘနေမကလေဝဲဒါစပါဒါဝီမ
Abishag was still there, and Adonijah says, I want her as my wife.
ဖဲနေနော်နာဘိရှာနေဝဲဒါဖဲနေနော်ဘနေဆောအဒိုနီယာနေတဲ့ဒါလေရဲ့ဆာလကောလာကမီဒါယမမ
It's a very strange request, a very dangerous request.
မီဝဲဒါတလာလောချောဒိုမာတခိကညာဝဲနေနော်မီတာအဝဲခိဝဲဒါလေအဝဲလောဘယိုဒိုမာ
Bathsheba says, I will go to King Solomon to ask that Abishag be given to you as your wife.
နော်ဘာသရှိဘာစီဝဲဒါယကလေဆူဆောရှလမိုအိုရနီကတဲအောလာကီလဝဲဒါနာဘိရှာလာကမီဝဲဒါနမ
Bathsheba goes to King Solomon and says, O King Solomon, I have one request.
နော်ဘာသရှိဘာလေဝဲဒါဆူဆောရှလမိုဘဒါဇဲဒါဆောပါရှလမိုခဲနေယဝဲဒါဒါယတခိကညာနာတမီ
And King Solomon says, Oh, what is that one request? Surely I will grant you any request you want.
ဝဲတဲဒါနော်အိုနော်နတခိနေမီဝဲဒါတမ်နေနော်ယကိလလာနာတတမီလာလာနေခိမတလနေဆာလောနေ
Then Bathsheba said, Give Abishag to be wife to Adonijah.
ဖဲနေနော်နဘာသရှိဘာစီဝဲဒါနော်ဟီလဝဲဒါနော်အဘိရှာနော်လေအဝဲကမီဝဲဒါအဝဲဆောအဒိုနီယာမန်နေတကေ
And Solomon says, What? He may as well ask for my kingdom.
ဖဲနေနေနော်ဝဲစပါရှလမိုဆဲဒါတမ်နေလဲနော်မောမေမေဒနေနေနော်မဲကလလာခိဝဲဒါလေယဘယမနေမ
Adonijah, by asking for David's wife, was claiming, in that way, claiming to be David's replacement.
le so adonia no la weda khiweda awe so pa da we amani no awe da pa plat weda no la weda ke ma pure ke komane ke weda le lo so le so pa da we alomo
I've often been puzzled by this story.
na ke weda le to block ni no ye chok mo no weda le ta ri we mo
I can't imagine that Adonijah would not expect that type of response from Solomon.
ni chumo ta le awe da kan ne so adonia de awe da de chok mo weda le awe da kan ne so sholomo ke hi to ta si se de ne ba mo
How could Adonijah not see that that was a very dangerous request to have David's wife, young wife, virgin wife, given to him? How could he not know that that was very dangerous?
nó lơ so dunia ni nó là te tin nhau đã lơ awen khi we đã nó so pa đã we ama nó lơ ame đã mười con nó lobo so si gai mo đi so lơ awen nó khi we đã ta we ni nó te mi we đã ta la alo pli le no alo ba yo le no ba ne ate tin nhau ba ne di le mo
And Bathsheba must have known that Solomon would become very angry when that request was made.
nó ba te shi ba nó cái tin nhau đã le nó ta we ni nó we ta su khi cái nhà khai nó le do ni ba we da ta we ni no ke so ko ma ta tho da so shilo mo mo
I don't know, and you have to kind of read between the lines, but I think Bathsheba must have known that Solomon would get very angry and would react in a very forceful way.
na pe ni cho mo ta le na ba ti shi ba de ti nya we no a ti nya we da le so pa shilo mo ni no ka ta tho we da ta pa do na ba da we da ke hi tho ge da ta si se no le ta da su ru ba mo
And Solomon did. He gave Benaiah the command to strike Adonijah dead.
na pe ni ni no we da ka ni so shilo mo na we da ta da pa do ba ni ni no me we da no a we da ka ni ti ko pa do sa ba na ya le ba ni no ma ti we da a we so adonia ni lo
As I said, you sort of need to read between the lines here.
cái nào lưu bạc qua đã lưu tạc lô cái chú phê mà bạc khát đi giáo đã phê này
But I think that Bathsheba knew that that would be the end of Adonijah.
ye chú có mua lên nó awen nó ba ship tí ship ba nào tí nhau đã lưu tạc vậy nè nó mới đã so adonia tao mua la cái tên này lo
I think she knew that this was a way to get rid of Adonijah.
awen đã tí nhau đã nó lưu awen đã mi đã tao vậy nè clear nó lưu tạc mà hama quê đã nó so adonia tao mua này lo
King Solomon's throne is firmly established.
Penny nó so pa sholomo nó alo pesone nó bata pa lo go gluk le ni lo
Joab is dead.
so yo anethi we dali
Abiathar is sent away.
kele so ba ya thane no bata se ku le yi
Adonijah is dead.
so adonia thi we dali
We talked a couple of weeks ago about Shimei. Shimei is dead.
no la pukui no sanwi na poko to we da ba ka le so shimia ge so shimia na ke thi we dali
King Solomon's throne is firmly established.
so pa sholomo alo pesone no bata thu lo go gluk le ni lo
Solomon's name means a man of peace.
so sholomo amia kapnya mi we da no awe ta khuta pho mo
Perhaps you know the Hebrew word shalom.
Batilen sinya da Hebrea taktola da Shalom.
Yeah, that's
Uh,
Solomon's
Shalom.
name is Shalom.
Shalom no ke
Yeah.
dale Shalom no ke dale takuta puma.
But as we see, there's a lot of bloodshed happening at the beginning of his reign.
no basa tange dipeti weda no le aweda ta pe ta la continue sa to tane no bwe weda do ta thu ta so ra lo tane lo
But Solomon becomes the greatest king,
basa do so pa shlomo no ke to weda no so pa la do gdera
right? As you go through the stories of Solomon, you read about the Queen of Sheba who comes to hear Solomon's wisdom.
ni to pa pa se tu me nya ni no pe ti weda le so pa shlomo no ami hu ta pla me so pa pa do ba ni no pa mi le shiba no pa mi he weda ba ne do gna weda so pa shlomo ta ku thi ni lo
He writes scores and scores of proverbs.
aweda na kwe weda li thu thir pa no le mi weda li kutu do thir pa
The book of Ecclesiastes is thought to be written by him.
ke weda le li pa se te lo ta ni no pa chok mo le so pa shulu mo kwe weda
Song of Songs is thought to be written by him.
le aweda ta wit pa ta wit ni na ki no ta chok mo le so pa shulu mo kwe weda
King Solomon pointed forward to the Lord Jesus Christ.
so pa shulu mo weda du ne so weda le ke sai shukri ni lo
Christ is the perfect man of peace. He's the King of peace.
kri na weda mi weda pwa le ta khuta pho mi weda ta khuta pho so pa
He has all the wisdom of King Solomon.
aweda dota ku ba ku thi no le awes di to so pa shulu mo tho
And the kingdom that Jesus Christ establishes is a kingdom of peace.
ta bom mi le ke sai shukri pa lo weda thu lo weda ni mi weda ta khuta pho bom mi mo
Okay, so that brings us to the end of King David and
ta
the
wen no
beginning
tu weda le so pa da weda o mu le kikte
and the beginning of King Solomon.
ma le so pa shlomo ata o mu sa ta